Good morning, everyone. Am I coming through okay?
Hi.
Excellent. Good morning. Thanks for coming to the seminar today. My name is Michael Carr, and I'm a senior tax manager here at Trout CPA. My role is primarily to work with taxing authorities and other government officials to correct tax notices and to become compliant with taxing authorities as needed and represent taxpayers under audit. Today's presentation is mostly going to be from the tax perspective. There are legal penalties that can be involved in employee misclassification that we won't be exploring today. If you have concerns about the legal penalties involved in employee misclassification, I would advise talking with your attorney. Today, I'm going to be talking about very important and recurring topic in the field of payroll and human resources. What is the difference between an independent contractor and an employee? The government figures there's about 25 to 30% of all employees are misclassified as independent contractors. Seems like it's, 1 in 3 is not exactly a good number. So what makes it so hard to classify an independent contractor versus an employee? An independent contractor just gets a 1099, right? And an employee gets W-2. That's pretty simple stuff. We can all go home. I've gone over the presentation. But it's actually a lot more complex than this. To start off, let's look at what makes an independent contractor from the independent contractor's perspective. From an independent contractor's perspective, they are generally self-employed. When you think self-employed, think of the gig economy. These are your DoorDashers, your Uber drivers, your Instacart employees, Grubhub, etc. These workers have a responsibility to file a tax return on their own and generally are required to make quarterly tax estimates. They're responsible for both the employer and the employee's portion of Medicare and Social Security taxes, generally known as the self-employment tax, on top of their own taxes. They generally qualify for the home office deduction if they use a part of their home for the business. These are workers who are considered to be in business for themselves. These self-employed individuals also have to consider whether people they work with are independent contractors or employees as well. They are hiring or contracting with workers all the time to provide services for their customers or their businesses. So they have the same concerns that you do. How do I classify someone as an independent contractor or employee? So from a payer's perspective, how do you determine who is an independent contractor or an employee? A business may pay an independent contractor and an employee for the same or similar work, but there are key differences between the two. It is critical that businesses correctly determine whether the people providing services are employees or independent contractors. At its most basic, it comes down to control. Who controls what is done, how it is done, and when it is done? To be more specific, let's look at this chart here. So an employee is going to get a W-2 at year end. A 1099 is going to get issued to an independent contractor. An employee works mainly for one company at a time, whereas the contractor may do work for multiple companies at the same time. And that there's no restriction that a payor can put onto that. It's a requirement that they have the flexibility to work for as many people as they want as an independent contractor. In the employee case, the employer controls the income, how much is paid. Whereas a contractor, the profit or loss is determined by the individual contractor. They're making decisions on how much they need to charge for something They're making decisions on how much an expense that they're willing to incur in order to provide a service. So the net of that, which is their profit or loss. An employee is paid on a consistent basis. This is either on an hourly, weekly, monthly basis, can even be annual, very rarely. Whereas the contractor is paid per invoice submission or upon completion of the job. Can also be paid intermittently throughout the job. It's not specifically at the end of the job, but the key factor is that it is paid based upon the contractor's desire. An employee may be eligible for overtime pay. Contractor is not eligible for overtime pay. That's a key difference, and we'll get into that a little bit later. An employee has income, unemployment, Social Security, and Medicare taxes withheld from wages paid. Whereas a contractor has no taxes withheld from payment for services. So they're responsible, as said earlier, for their income taxes, for their unemployment, well, not their unemployment, their Social Security and their Medicare. Employee can qualify for company and government benefits, whereas the contractor is responsible for seeking and arranging their own benefits. Employee is part of the company's daily workings with an ongoing relationship and responsibilities, whereas a contractor is hired just when needed. Employee follows guidelines to how, where, and when work is to be completed. They don't really have the autonomy to make a decision on their own. Whereas a contractor establishes how and when a work is to be completed. They have almost complete autonomy within reason. An employee is trained by the company to perform their job, where it's expected the contractor is already going to be self-trained and self-skilled to perform whatever job they're being hired for. Employee is provided the tools to do their job by the employer, whereas the contractor is expected to bring their own tools, equipment, and materials to the work site. An employee is subject to firing, discipline, and rewards. Contractors responsible for their own self-employment. While there still can be discipline for non-completion or poor performance, it's not in the same vein as the employee-employer relationship. Employee is able to terminate their services at any time, whereas a contractor is required to complete contracted work. As you can see, in general, an employee is anyone who performs services if the business can control what will be done and how it will be done. In general, an independent contractor are individuals in an independent trade, business, or profession in which they offer their services to the public. What is key is the business has the right to control the details of how the workers' services are performed. All of this can be summed up into three main categories that help define the relationship as either an employee or an independent contractor. The first category is behavioral control. Does the business have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does the job? The more control the company has, the more likely it's an employee-employer relationship. The second category is financial control. Does the business direct or control the financial and business aspect of the worker's job? These are things like how the worker is paid, are expenses reimbursed, who provides tools and supplies, etc. The third category is the relationship of the parties. Are there written contracts or employee-type benefits such as pension plan, insurance, or vacation pay provided to the worker? Also, will the relationship continue after the work is done, and is the work performed a key aspect of the business? Businesses must weigh all these factors when determining whether a worker is an employee or independent contractor. Some factors may indicate that the worker is an employee, while other factors may indicate that the worker is an independent contractor. There is no magic or set number of factors that makes the worker an employee or independent contractor, and no factor stands alone in making this determination. In addition, factors that are relevant in one situation may not be relevant in another. The keys are to look at the entire relationship and consider the extent of the right to direct and control the worker. Once you do that, it is important then to document this relationship. The question then becomes, if it is so difficult and so case by case as to whether a worker is an employee or independent contractor, why go to all the effort to properly classify them? Who actually cares which category a worker falls under? Well, there are three main groups that care in Pennsylvania and will actively make the determination as to whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor for you. These are the IRS, the PA Unemployment Department of Labor, and the employee independent contractor themselves. So why does the IRS care? Don't they get their money one way or another? It's either the employer is providing the payroll taxes through remittance on a semi-weekly basis or quarterly basis, or the IRS is getting the money at the end of the year when the independent contractor files their tax returns. Well, the IRS has indicated that it's a lot easier for them to collect from an employer than it is from an independent contractor. I can't give you the exact percentages, but it's far more likely for an independent contractor to not report their income properly and not to remit their end-of-year taxes than it is for the IRS to assert control over an employer and make sure that they're paying their payroll taxes on a semi-regular basis. So how does the IRS find out if a business is misclassifying employees as independent contractors? There are two major ways. One way is through a worker classification audit or a traditional IRS audit, where the auditor determines there is potential misclassification. The other way is through an independent contractor reporting the business to the IRS. We'll get to how in a bit. So what are the consequences of not properly classifying employees? If the business is supposed to treat someone as an employee and they're not, the business can be held responsible for the employer portion of the employment taxes for that worker. In addition, the businesses can face penalties for improper deposits, late payment, possibly late filings of returns if they never filed before. And on top of all that, then they can be assessed interest on all those taxes, which at the moment is at 8%. It's not cheap anymore to not pay the IRS. Used to be under 2%. We're now at 8%. Then on top of that, once the IRS determines they're an employee and has assessed their payroll taxes, they're then going to report down the chain to the state, to PA Unemployment, to your local taxing authority, that they should be seeing a W-2 for these misclassified employees as well. Which means more penalties. It means more taxes due. We don't see these types of audits happen that much amongst our client base. Even on the IRS audits that are performed by the local IRS office, we do not see them looking too deep into employee misclassifications. They are asking though, so it's definitely something that needs to be properly documented. Where we see the most enforcement is under PA Unemployment, the Department of Labor. Why do they care? Well, it's a couple of reasons. Unlike Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes, unemployment is funded completely by employees and their employers. So without proper classification, unemployment does not get properly funded. Well, the reason why that's important right now is between 2000 and 2022, due to the pandemic, there was an increase in unemployment that was paid out, significantly more than usual. As a result of this depletion of the unemployment funds, we are seeing a significant increase in unemployment audits. These typically are electronic online audits and can feel very intrusive in the amount of information that is requested. Improperly reporting an employee as an independent contractor can lead to penalty and interest for late payment on top of an assessment for the unpaid unemployment taxes. Unlike a worker misclassification audit by the IRS, the information uncovered during an unemployment audit is typically not shared with other taxing authorities. So then finally, why does an independent contractor care whether they're properly classified? Well, that's pretty simple. There's more benefit to being an employee than an independent contractor. If they're classified as an independent contractor, they're subject to self-employment tax, both the employee and the employer portion of Social Security and Medicare. If they are an employee, they're only responsible for the employee portion. So that right there saves them 7.65%. On top of that, if they're misclassified as an independent contractor, they lose out on employee benefits, such as health insurance, vacation pay, pension, and probably the most crucial, overtime. So there's a lot of incentive to assert they're an employee and not an independent contractor. So how does an independent contractor assert that they are an employee and not an independent contractor? Well, when they file their annual 1040, they can file a Form 8919, uncollected Social Security and Medicare taxes on wages, to figure and report their share of uncollected Social Security and Medicare as if they were an employee, or they should have been. This is an automatic red flag to the IRS that a taxpayer feels they aren't being properly classified, and to potentially open up a worker misclassification audit on the business they work for. Since this is a form that's filed at the individual level, by the time a business finds out it's been filed, it's already too late. So how can businesses protect themselves from the government and workers seeking to reclassify the worker from independent contractor to employee? If there's a disagreement between the worker and the business, and you know in advance, you can be proactive. You can file the form SS8, which allows the business to request the IRS make the determination as to whether the worker is an independent contractor or employee. This can also be filed by the worker, so just be aware of that. And right now, it's taking at least 6 months for this form to process through the IRS. That was at last check. It's probably taking longer right now because the IRS is still significantly backlogged and understaffed as a result of the pandemic. In addition, there's also the voluntary classification settlement program, which allows a business to reclassify their workers as employees for future tax periods for employment tax purposes with partial relief from federal employment taxes. Typically, you'll end up paying about 25% of the employment tax liability from the most recent tax year. As long as you are willing to agree to prospectively treat your workers, either a class or group of workers, as employees. There are certain eligibility requirements that must be met that we won't go over at this seminar because they're quite long. The program is applied for using Form 8952 and entering into a closing agreement with the IRS. The other way a business can protect themselves is through documentation. I think I've said this a few times now, that documentation is incredibly important in protecting yourself from these misclassification audits or from an independent contractor asserting that they are actually an employee. And the things I'm going to be going over are based upon 2 successful PA unemployment audits we've been through recently. These items were the items that were either requested or were provided. And as a result, we were able to get no change audits from PA Department of Labor. The most important document, and the one I want to emphasize the most here, is the independent contractor agreement. I will say that just about every business that I talk to does not have this when I initially talk to them. What it is, it's an agreement that lays out that the work that's being performed is a single instance only. It describes in detail what the work is, and then specifically says that the worker is an independent contractor, and then it's signed by both parties. This is a very key document to have. In all cases that I have worked with auditors, they have used this as their primary reason for determining that a worker is an independent contractor. After that, you want to look at making sure you get W-9s and annually issued 1099s. I realize that getting a W-9 is not a mandatory requirement by the government. However, having that W-9 and issuing 1099s provides the paper trail that these auditors will look at to see whether or not this is an independent contractor or not. While it seems simple and not that significant, getting a business card, it just helps establish that you thought that this was an independent contractor. You were not hiring John Doe. You were hiring John Doe's Landscaping. That's what that business card says. At the same time, verify whether the contractor has liability insurance. That'll protect you in a variety of ways, but it helps steer the auditors to the fact that this person has their own separate business. They have their own liability insurance. They have their own separate business. And then the one that surprised me the most that actually came up, it's the weakest form of documentation you can have. But it was one that we were able to win on, was, does the contractor have a website where they hold themselves out to be an independent contractor, where they solicit work from other businesses? It was a case where we had none of the other items. We had no W-9, no 1099s issued, no business cards, no independent contractor agreement, no verification of insurance status. And the auditor was willing to accept the website as our proof that this was an independent contractor. It was very surprising. When it comes to worker classification, it is always best to be proactive. And I think I mentioned this a few times, not reactive. You want to make sure you have these things now, not when the auditor comes to your door. Rather than waiting for a potentially negative situation to occur, you should make it clear to your workers exactly how they will be classified from the start. And again, make sure that you document that classification. That's all I have for today. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Michael. I do not have any current questions posted in the chat, but you were very informative. Great explanations. If anyone does have any questions following this session, please don't hesitate to contact us. We'd be happy to address any specific. Oh, I spoke too soon, Michael. Do we have a template for an independent contractor agreement?
I would say you can Google it, but I would say reach out to your attorney and they should have one that they can provide to you.